All right, welcome everybody. This is the second session in our embodied carbon track for the Carbon Positive Reset. So welcome to the session, Forest and the Trees and Grass, Procuring Climate Smart Mass Timber and Bamboo. While not necessarily a new material, mass timber is growing in popularity as a low carbon alternative to concrete and steel. This session will dive into what designers need to know in order to get mass timber right, and what innovations are occurring that we can likely expect to see in the future marketplace. As a note, we are offering all sessions available with live Spanish interpretation, which you can access by hitting the interpretation globe icon. We'll also try and get to all Q&A that comes in, but if we can't, we will have the panelists answer that and we'll post it on the CarbonPositive website later on. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the session, Kate Simonen. Kate is the founding director of the Carbon Leadership Forum and an associate professor at the University of Washington College of the Built Environment. She is a writer, a researcher, and a researcher with significant professional experience in high performance building design. And with that, Kate, feel free to take it away.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to introduce this really important session as we look to decarbonize the building sector and particularly building materials. While we can focus a lot on reducing emissions, we really can't forget the opportunity that we can store carbon in building materials, and biogenic materials are a really great opportunity to do that. I'm going to introduce the two speakers, and then after they present, we'll have some time for some questions. So do think about adding your questions in. The first, we're going to start with Edie Sonne Hall. She has a PhD and she represents Three Tree Consultings. She brings over 20 years of experience and connections in the area of forest carbon accounting, ecosystem services, green building, life cycle assessment, and sustainable forest certifications. She's going to be providing a global context about what designers need to know to get forest products right. Following that, we'll transition to Troy Carter, who's a co-founder of RIZOME and bringing the audacious scale and vision of startup methodology to the planet's ecological and climate crisis. He has focused on carbon finance and renewable energy and agricultural products for the last 6 years, and he's now supporting RIZOME to grow a globally significant climate positive building material and carbon sequestering company that uses bamboo in unique ways. So now I'd like to introduce you to Edie. Can you share your screen?
I can. Thank you, everybody. So let me just get my screen. All right. Can you guys see everything okay? Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Edie Sonne Hall, and I'm founder of Three Trees Consulting, where I work on forest-related projects that live at the intersection between science and policy and management. So I've worked for large multinational forest products companies, and I also am a small family tree farmer myself, with experience in northeastern mixed hardwood forests, southeastern loblolly and longleaf ecosystems, and the Pacific Northwest Douglas fir forests, as well as the dry, fire-prone forests in eastern Washington. I have a science background in forest carbon accounting and life cycle assessment, and I've participated on numerous local, regional, national, and international working groups focused on how forests and wood products can help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. These discussions have led me into the building sector arena, and I've been inspired and impressed by the work and goals of Architecture 2030, especially around embodied carbon. So I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. So back to forests. One of the themes I will try to communicate to you today is that context is important. So forest species and forest health risk drivers are different even within the same state. It's really important to understand the link between carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and forest is a two-way street. And even without human intervention, forests take in carbon dioxide when they are growing, and they then release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere upon decay or combustion, either due to mortality from insects or wind or fire or just natural senescence. Adding in the wood production extends this cycle by moving carbon into a pool that stores carbon during its useful life and then re-releases upon combustion or decay. So the goal is to make sure that there is more carbon going out of the atmosphere and less going into it. And I will talk about ways you as a designer can help align with this goal. So a little setting the stage. So though this talk is focused on wood procurement in general, the big buzz is on the potential benefits of mass timber in large buildings. And indeed, the embodied carbon in a building framed with mass timber shows a ton of promise, and a lot of people are studying the carbon implications. The Nature Conservancy has commissioned studies to look at cross-laminated timber buildings made in 3 regions in the US and in Chile and in China, and the preliminary results will be out soon. The Tall Wood Building Project at NC State is working on a series of studies examining embodied carbon in CLT mass timber buildings, and in one of them, they just published a comparative LCA, Liang et al. In 2020, of mass timber building and concrete alternative in Portland, Oregon, and found that the 12-story mixed-use building had an 18% reduction in global warming potential compared to an alternative concrete building. And much of the embodied carbon in that building resulted actually from an increased use of gypsum board. So there are a lot of benefits of wood, and it's generally intuitive that it takes a lot less energy to saw up a 2x4 and glue it together than some high alternatives. In addition, half the dry weight of wood is carbon, which is keeping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But it's also widely understood that wood is sourced from a forest, and forests can either be managed sustainably or not. So the good news is that consumers can be smart about their wood procurement choices, and through their actions create more forest rather than fewer. So how do we do this? The first step is knowing where your wood is coming from. At a very high level, this will determine your risk factor about whether or not you need to take extra precautions to ensure that your wood is coming from a certified forest. And I will get to that in a bit. So over the next few slides, I'm going to go over a few great sources of information to tell you a little bit more about what is happening in the forest in the countries where you are sourcing your wood. One important piece of information to convey is that there is a big difference between forest management wood harvesting and deforestation or forest degradation. So though the US has the highest rates of industrial roundwood production, which is the international term that's used to mean wood harvested for the purpose of making into a commercial product, it has a very low risk of deforestation. And in fact, a meta-analysis overlaying a country's harvest with deforestation shows that to be the case generally globally. And the opposite is true. So why is that? Well, if there's a demand for a product, then there's an incentive for the landowner to grow that product. Conversely, this World Wildlife Fund map on the left here shows the hotspots for deforestation over the next 20 years. And these are typically areas with either poor governance or property rights and or high pressure for land use in something other than a forest, such as agriculture or grazing. You can also look at the carbon balance associated with a country's forest. So this data comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, which compiles a wealth of data related to forest and harvesting in addition to many other things. So here it shows that the countries that have the forest land that are a major carbon dioxide sink are China, Russia, Malaysia, Brazil, and the United States. Countries whose forests produce the highest net emissions of CO2 from forest degradation, whether from natural or human causes, are Indonesia, India, and Iran. And sorry, so is Brazil. I misspoke here on this. In addition, countries with the highest CO2 emissions from conversion of forest land to other uses are Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Paraguay. This is another handy chart that's also compiled by the FAO, and it provides a checklist for how different regions are doing relative to the Sustainable Development Goals. In this case, we're focused on Sustainable Development Goal 15, which is life on land, and the three principal indicators are forest area, sustainable forest management, and mountain green cover. So this chart is a little busy, but it keeps track of whether or not there's a positive, negative, or no change in the forest following areas. So there's the forest area annual net change, above ground biomass stocks and forest, the proportion of forest area within legally based protected, the amount of forest area that each county started from, not necessarily where they are right now.
Edie, I suggest turning off your camera.
With cool Esri maps on forest benefits, threats, and stewardship. If you are new to forestry in the US in general, the Carbon Leadership Forum just put out an extensive 8-week series explaining forest, wood product, and the carbon cycle. And that may be really helpful in interpreting some of this data. Okay, so we've determined where our wood is coming from. If we are in North America, we are pretty good. If we are in Brazil, we may need an extra level of assurance. Either way, it does not hurt to have extra levels of assurances. And that highest level of assurance is sourcing a wood product that comes from a certified forest. So there are two global systems, FSC and PEFC. FSC is a global standard with regional variations, and PEFC is the umbrella system that certifies individual countries' systems. So the three principal certification systems in the US are SFI, FSC, and ATFS. Acronym city here. SFI is a single North American standard, only available in the US and Canada, and the American Tree Farm System is focused on small US landowners. And both SFI and American Tree Farm System fall under the umbrella of PEFC. Forest management certification is based on principles that promote sustainable forest management, such as water quality, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and protection of forests with exceptional conservation values. And these are third-party certified, where an auditor comes out and judges against a series of agreed standards. In Canada, about 47% of forests are certified, and in the US, about 19% are certified. And both of these countries are well above the average of 11%. But just because a forest isn't certified doesn't mean it's not sustainable. So how do you know? Step 3. This is the last step, guys. SFI and FSC both have mill-focused certifications to provide assurances about all the wood that's coming through its supply chain, even the uncertified material. So the FSC-controlled wood standard requires a risk analysis to show that wood is not coming from the following sources: GMO trees, conversion to a non-forest use, conversion or a forest with a high conservation value, or wood that has been harvested in violation of traditional or civil rights, or of course, illegal harvest. The SFI fiber sourcing standard looks at the wood supply area to ensure that fiber is procured responsibly. It requires wood fiber sources from areas that are instituting best management practices for water quality, such as riparian buffers, using trained loggers, and protecting forests with exceptional conservation value, as well as avoiding controversial sources, such as areas without effective social laws and, of course, illegal harvest. So these provided an added layer of assurance against the entire supply chain. So finally, chain of custody certification is the method of certifying that the accounting can be delivered from the forest all the way to the consumer. So I'm going to walk you through this example as the labels can get confusing. Now, I would urge you to do a double check with the actual certification systems, as I may not have the latest labels and I do not know the nuances associated with double labeling in the case where there are two certifications. But let's just take a hypothetical example of a sawmill that sources 20% of its wood from a forest that has a FSC on the ground forest certification system, 20% from a forest with SFI, and 20% from a forest with American Tree Farm system. And the remaining 40% comes from fiber that does not have a certified sustainable forest management system. But the mill itself is certified under the FSC controlled wood certification as well as SFI fiber sourcing. So through chain of custody, it can pass the following labels on to its customer. On the 20% of the products going out, it can label FSC 100% from a well-managed forest label. On 20%, it can label SFI certified chain of custody logo, or it can use the PEFC label instead. Remember that SFI falls under the umbrella of PEFC. And the American Tree Farm system also can be labeled under PEFC. The remaining forests can be labeled in these labels at the bottom. The remaining products can be labeled at these at the bottom. The key is to make sure that you never label more products as 100% certified than the percentage of fiber that come from that type of certified forest. So I've covered a lot on strategies for identifying sustainable sourcing. I wanted to circle back for how this all fits into the climate piece and end with some food for thought for the building community. So above here describes the strategies outlined by the IPCC for how the forest sector can help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. These broadly are to take more carbon out of the atmosphere by planting more trees, by increasing carbon stocks in existing forests, and increasing wood product carbon storage. And additionally, by reducing emissions to the atmosphere, either by reducing emissions from deforestation or fire, or by reducing the need to use fossil fuels or energy to make more energy-intensive products through the use of bioenergy and wood products. Builders and architects can be partners in this goal, as there are many overlapping strategies. And some of these strategies actually require work on the demand and the use side. So here are 3 ideas to take home from you. Build vibrant, high-density communities to keep pressure of development off of working forest lands and provide an economic incentive to have forests. Build with wood and use wood efficiently. Focus on reuse and extending the life of the product. And of course, source wood from sustainably managed forests. I will leave it at that and look forward to any additional questions.
Great, thank you very much, Edie. We're starting to get some questions into the question and answer session, so please put those that you have in there, and we'll come back to do questions at the end as we transfer now over to Troy. Hello, Troy. There we see your presentation.
Hi. So my name is Troy Carter. Thanks, Edie, for the handoff. I'm a co-founder at RIZOME, and RIZOME is pioneering bamboo engineered lumber. So when we're talking about mass timber and decarbonized built environment, bamboo is an amazing technology that can help address some of these issues. So I probably don't need to convince anyone in this audience right now of the scope of the issue. So concrete and steel, if we build all of the buildings that will be required over the next 30 years, we're going to hit some major climate thresholds that we don't want to hit if we build those out of steel and concrete. Wood, so mass timber, is an amazing technology, and particularly for North America, Western Europe, these are areas that have, we're doing a pretty good job in North America of harvesting sustainably. And so one of the fundamental issues is that that's actually just not the case globally. The map that Edie showed earlier of places, sub-Saharan Africa, Indonesia, India, these are places with almost 100% deforestation where mass timber will not be the technology of choice. The harvest times are too long, and basically trees won't mature fast enough in order to meet the demand for new building. So there has to be another alternative to wood, and we really don't want to build them with steel and concrete. So RIZOME has developed a manufacturing process and supply chain for structural bamboo engineered lumber. And we essentially make plywood. And so maybe just on the overall scope of why is bamboo good? One, it's climate positive, means the more you build with it, the better the impact on the climate. Rather than just reducing harm, it's actually a carbon sink. And because when we cut it down, it grows right back, it doesn't have many of the ecological impacts that traditional forestry has. Because when we clear cut a forest, it has major soil and erosion problems that actually, on balance, are not necessarily good for the environment. So bamboo is a super regenerative material, and it's also a really technically sophisticated material. So the common conception about bamboo is sort of like these seemingly rickety or cottage industry structures, or it's used for chopsticks and toothpicks. The reality is that it's a really technically advanced material, especially when it's in an engineered product. So 2.5 times the strength to weight versus steel, and super fire resistant. The only natural biological material that has a Class A fire rating. So it's in the same fire rating category as gypsum and steel and concrete. So for tall mass timber, suddenly we can have these massive, beautiful exposed beams without the fire risk. Another really important element is that, why has it not happened? And one of the major reasons is supply chain reliability and price. And so that's something that we're pioneering, and many, many other companies will start entering this space, as the technology risk and supply chain becomes more advanced. But over the next couple years, we'll reach price parity with other structural wood products. And over the next 10 years, we'll see a massive increase in plantings and manufacturing operations that are making bamboo structural lumber. So while it's almost not a material that you can get right now because the supply is so small, but one of the great things is that bamboo grows really fast. And it grows really, really fast. Just think about an order of magnitude calculation. A 3-year-old Douglas fir, is maybe a couple pencils around and 4 or 5 feet tall. A 3-year-old Dendrocalamus giganteus can be, 100 to 120 feet tall, multiple 6 to 12 inch culms. So it's a different order of magnitude of growth. And because it grows so fast, it's also, we only use clumping bamboo species rather than running bamboo species, so it doesn't outcompete other native species. Because it grows so fast, the carbon sequestration rate it's really impressive. It's one of the most scalable technologies we know of to cheaply sequester carbon. And the carbon has to be stored somewhere, right? It can either be stored in the biomass in a living forest, in the built environment, or in the soil. And so the built environment is the largest carbon sink that humans have created. And so we believe that this is a major contributor to addressing the climate crisis. And just to get a sense of scope, how big is bamboo as a solution? So just internally at our company, we have a goal of sequestering 10 gigatons of carbon by 2050. And 10 gigatons of carbon is 1% of all anthropogenic carbon emissions. That means all the CO2 that humanity's ever emitted into the atmosphere. So that means, what sort of scale is that? That means about 1 million hectares of giant bamboo under continual cultivation and harvest and putting it into building materials. And the scope of that is about 1% of global construction and about 1,000 processing facilities globally. So that means all over the equatorial regions that was in Edie's map: Indonesia, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mexico, Central America. These are all regions that can grow bamboo very effectively. They have super great warm, moist, hot climates. And the giant bamboo species, we use Dendrocalamus asper, Dendrocalamus giganteus, and a few other species that we're doing genetic selection on. And more, the countries that have been least represented in sustainable forestry will actually become the places where, material in India can be grown, manufactured, and used in India for, a complete holistic regenerative system. And there's a bunch of things that need to happen. This is an industry that's really just starting out. It's been an academic material. Everyone, in lumber and forestry has known about bamboo for a long time, but just now the price of lumber is, skyrocketing through the roof as global supply is down, and the bamboo supply chain is getting mature enough that it can actually start meeting customer orders in a big way. So that's sort of just like the global meta perspective on bamboo. Specifically, what we're doing is building the first full-scale manufacturing facility in the Philippines with a really large species of bamboo, and then replicating that manufacturing model around the world to build as rigorous a supply chain as exists for lumber. So if you want to know more specifically about RIZOME or bamboo in general, we've got a ton of resources. You can just send an email, troy@rhizomeco.com, go to our website, and there's a lot of architects, designers, engineers, funders, probably lumber companies for hybrid bamboo wood products. This will see a lot of product development and design innovation over the coming years. So feel free to reach out to us for potential strategic partnerships, and stay tuned, because it's really an industry that is just starting. It's been a cottage industry for a long time and is just now entering a level of maturity where, if you're building a skyscraper in a couple years in Dubai and you want to build it with a regenerative material, you can build it out of wood, you can build it out of steel, you can build it out of concrete. But we think that bamboo will occupy a place that is actually technically superior and more regenerative than each of these materials. So thanks for the time, and happy to take some questions if Kate wants to chime in a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so we got a series of questions coming in, but I'm going to start with one. Troy, you mentioned that this is not really available today. What can we do as architects and specifiers to advance an industry that doesn't yet exist? I mean, what can we do?
We all know, like 10 years from now, we will all know that this was coming, and now we have to make it happen. So how do we make that happen? One is code compliance. So, if there's regulators in the audience, we're working on testing, we're working on code compliance. This has been a long time coming. So in a couple of years, this will be fully code compliant, but it's a lot of steps to get there. A second is essentially designing for the material. We have, we have the technical specs. We have a lot of sort of like prototype and pilot level supply available. And one of the major reasons why bamboo will be important is because of its strength and fire characteristics. So we will be able to build buildings that are simpler, that are easier to do with prefab construction, but we have to have architects and designers that do concept renderings, that plan on building for the material in ways that we haven't been able to use just because it's a much less strong material. So designers, great, give us a call. We'll support you to build designs over the coming years. And then also customers. So this is lumber companies, forestry companies that want to develop strategic partnerships, because for the next, let's say 10 years, there's just not going to be enough bamboo to actually meet demand. We see a lot of demand. So one thing that we can do is build hybrid wood bamboo structures where it's mostly wood, and then bamboo comes in to provide a tension layer and a fire layer on wood surfaces. So it's an awesome material. This is a piece of Douglas fir with bamboo on the side. And it's an amazing technical material that we'll be selling a lot of over the coming years. But in order to prove the supply chain, we have to prove a lot of demand. So the more demand we see, the faster the industry will grow.
Thanks. I mean, I think that the demand, but I really like your talk about codes and specs or codes and standards. You know, I think that that's often overlooked as a place that building professionals can act, but engaging in the codes and standards development practice is a key way that we can help advance that work. So that's really good to see. Edie, could you please unmute yourself? I have a question for you. So you talked about carbon smart and climate smart forestry, or you mentioned something about climate smart forestry. Could you talk a little bit about the nuance between those terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So just keep in mind that, and I sort of touched on this a little bit in the very beginning about the difference between, sorry. Hi, everybody. That really the interaction between forests and the atmosphere is a two-way street and is a lot impacted by nature and climate. And in fact, climate change exacerbates some of those natural interactions, as we are all well aware, especially in the West Coast, due to fires, if you're looking out the window right now. Wherever you are. And so some of the times it's important to focus on healthy, resilient forests that may or may not have as much carbon on the landscape as they possibly could be. So the example is you can grow a lot of trees in a fire-prone area, but if they are in an area where there's frequent fires and there's a lot of dry wood and fuel underground and a lot of biomass in that area, they have the potential to have a fire coming through and releasing a lot of carbon, which ultimately is going to impact the climate piece. But that focus on really focusing on having a healthy, resilient forest that's also productive is where you want that interaction, not just focused on taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I also point out to everybody, and we talked about this a lot in the certification piece, is that carbon is just one of the many ecosystem services that forests provide, in addition to wildlife and water and a whole bunch of other things. And it is truly important, but it's not the only driver of forests. So that's sort of where those two nuances are.
Great, thanks. Well, that goes to a good question to Troy. We had a question about the water use of bamboo. And I think, and then that also then talked about the glues and adhesives related to gluing it together. So could you talk a little bit about both of those issues?
Yeah. So broadly, it sounds like, well, it sounds a little bit too good to be true. Aren't there like ecological drawbacks, or like, isn't it gonna have awful effects for the building itself and VOCs or something like that? So just maybe a little bit more on the sustainability side. So one, bamboo's a really great plant for the ecosystem. And that's a generalization, maybe not everywhere in the world. So one, we use clumping bamboos, and I can give a case study for the Philippines. So over the past decade or so, there have been massive reforestation efforts on the island of Mindanao with very, very little, like low survival rate from the trees. And that's because of grass fires. It's because of economic incentives where the farmers just run their cattle on the ground right after planting a reforested area. They get paid to plant and then not incentivized to actually keep the trees. So bamboo solves a couple issues as a pioneering reforestation species. It can survive grass fires because it's a grass. It just, and if a cow eats the top of the clump, well, it just sends up a new shoot. It's a non-running species, so it doesn't take over native forest. It stays where you put it. It does take a lot of water, which is actually okay if it's an area where there is a lot of water. So, we don't grow it in desert regions and then extract groundwater to plant it. Well, we grow it in the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam, where there are natural monsoon seasons, where it can have a very, very high growth rate. And then also in places like Florida, where actually nutrient levels in the water are a major issue. Phosphates and nitrates are one of the major pollution issues and ecological devastation issues throughout the Gulf. And so bamboo actually like totally cleans the water as it passes through. So, you know, ancillary benefits. Also, as a long-term plantation model, you know, I don't want to live on just a bamboo planet. Like that's not what this is about. We're not trying to introduce the next monoculture, even if part of the industry, that probably will happen. Like there will be some players that do massive monocultures, just like we see with any other sort of like economically driven crop. However, I don't believe that actually has to be the model. One of the things that we're pioneering is essentially a small scale, low-tech, decentralized manufacturing model of 1,000 hectares around each processing facility, where then that gets aggregated into a more high-tech regional lamination facility. And that allows a large amount of native forest to be planted, at least in a 1-to-1 ratio around those areas in less harvestable areas, so that we can retain natural biodiversity. But just as a sense of why decentralization is possible with bamboo and not possible with most forestry products, I don't know if you've ever tried to cut down a Douglas fir tree that's at full scale and process it yourself, right? You can't do it at a human like physical scale. But you know, someone with a handsaw can just go cut down a clump of bamboo, send it through a splitter, and make their money for food that day. So it's an inherently decentralized, friendly product that, you know, can create economic justice for the people and retain land rights for the people, because it's not you don't have to have a huge centralized operation. So that's the business model also that we're trying to pioneer.
Okay, thanks, Troy. We got tons of really great questions here, and just 5 more minutes. Just to want to note that we can do our best to answer some of these other questions and post them on the CarbonPositive website if we don't get to all of these. So I guess I wanted to jump right now to Edie. I thought one of the early ones that we came in, there was a question about FSC. Why would they prohibit the use of GMO trees? So there was a couple of questions about that. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, just really basic. So GMO trees are genetically modified organizations. So when you're actually going in and putting in a different genotype, that is really way on the horizon on forestry. In fact, it's not. No trees that are out there are doing that right now. Certainly through traditional tree improvement programs, there's a lot of increase in wood product quality, et cetera. That's not what we're talking about. I'm guessing that the basics is that because forests are really a natural plantation type interaction, that there is a lot more work that would need to be done in order for people to feel comfortable with it.
Okay, so that's not a big issue right now that's happening.
No, it's nobody's doing GMO trees. Yeah.
And then could you follow up another question related to the difference between FSC well-managed forest versus FSC responsible sourcing? Because they look awfully much the same.
Yeah.
Right?
So again, please contact your FSC label person to get the the final scoop. But it's the difference between the on-the-ground certification, so coming from a well-managed forest, versus the mill having that controlled wood certification that looks at all of their supply chain, even the uncertified, un-FSC sources, to make sure it doesn't come from those 5 sources that I said were no-nos.
So if I get wood that's FSC sustainably sourcing, is that the responsible sourcing? I don't necessarily come from an FSC forest, but I at least know I'm not getting illegal wood, and that the mill itself, so the mill does that, where the other one is at the forest.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, I'm going to come back to Troy, and I'm going to ask you again about the glues, because we've got multiple questions about these glues.
Yeah.
How much is a bamboo beam? What percentage is glue? What percentage is bamboo?
So I'll speak in generalities because the manufacturing process is totally it's totally advancing. Generally, these are glues that are like totally acceptable with every VOC, European Union standard, very like, same glues as we'd see in very high quality plywood, CLT, things like that. It's the same glues for bamboo as you'd use for any other engineered wood product. In terms of glue amount, I'll compare it to what bamboo has been versus what it is now. So one of the major innovations that we have undertaken is a pretty rigorous genetic selection for the largest species of bamboo with very thick walls and really large dimensions. And that actually allows us to use about 75 to 80% less glue than a comparable bamboo panel made out of moso or luong, which is what you find all over China and Vietnam.
You know what? We're running out of time. So I think we're going to have to that sounds so I like so what you're getting at is that the bigger the chunks of bamboo you can get,
right.
The less amount of glue you can get. Right. And so it's
also stronger the material, better the performance, better the look, and that's the way innovation will continue in this area.
So great. Well, thank you everybody for participating and giving so many great questions. We could have gone on for a half an hour. Thank you to Troy and Edie for giving us some really great information, and to Architecture 2030 for putting on this great event. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you very much.